Hey YouTube, I'm here with another game from the Winning Pawn Structures by Alexander Baburin. This is going to be the last game that I have that specifically deals with the Rook lift. So let's take a look at it. This is somewhat a game from little known players. They're both quite strong GMs now, but at the time they played this, they were both just masters. So we have here a Caro Kann. And normally when you think of the Caro Kann in conjunction with an isolated queen pawn, you assume immediately the Panov Botvinnik Attack. However, it's clear that white has not chose this, as typically that attack is when we're going to take on d5 and recaptures and play c4. But we're going to discover here that that's not the only way for an isolated queen pawn to arise out of the Caro Kann. So we get d takes c4, and then black chooses this knight d7, which the idea is to be able to play f6 and have the option of, after a capture, to recapture with a knight instead of having to take with either the g or the e pawn. So we get knight f3, and then knight f6. White chooses to play knight back to g3. I guess assuming that he didn't want to capture here, because black could still choose to capture with this g pawn, and he's going to open the g file, and it could lead to some play for black. There's nothing wrong with making that decision, but I guess white just chose another way. So e6, and then bishop d3, and now c5. Just striking at the center here, trying to gain some space for his pieces. Here it castles, and then c takes d4, and then now the knight takes. And now we get bishop c5, and then after c3 and the bishop takes, and we take here, we have arrived at our isolated queen pawn. However, the pieces here are a little bit placed differently than we have come to expect from an isolated queen pawn. Most often, this knight would still be over here. And typically we would still have a light squared bishop on e7, and probably a knight also on f3. However, the absence or the changing of these features suggests that white should already be thinking about utilizing a kingside attack as his way of handling this isolated queen pawn position. The reason is this: he already has one extra piece on the kingside, given that the knight finds itself on g3 rather than c3, and then the fact that black has chose to trade his dark squared bishop for the knight here on d4 means that there's going to be a somewhat lacking of defense on these key dark squares here, which could probably even extend over to g7 depending on how the position goes. So I think given those features, it makes sense to why why white proceeded the way he did. He played bishop f4, which again, in the isolated queen pawns, we usually see the bishop going to g5. Sometimes it makes a pit stop at e3 first. But here on f4, it has its points too. So the the fact that the bishop now has access to e5, which from e5 it'll be able to help influence the queen side as well as the king side. Eventually this knight is going to have to move, and when it does, black will definitely get that e5 square. Another key feature to note is that given that missing dark square bishop and the fact that we have this knight on d7 rather than c6 means that this d4 pawn is not going to come under a lot of pressure very soon, which is just one more key feature of why black is choosing to go, why white is choosing to go for a kingside attack in this game. So we have the knight coming into d5, and then bishop d6, just trying to remain in place to be able to use this e5 square. But at the same time, this also is going to kick the rook over, which, as we saw in an earlier game, the rook being kicked away from the f file can mean that sometimes this rook is not going to be as well prepared to help defend the king side. So the rook comes over, we bring our rook to e1, and then black chooses to bring his other knight up to f6, and so the bishop gets to that e5 square that we were looking at before. And already we can envision a situation where this bishop could be quite strong here. If for some reason we played knight e4 and this knight were to find itself exchanged, and then we end up with a rook here, there could be some uncomfortable pins here. So bishop d7, trying to get active. And then a4. A move that I really like. I assume that given the theme of our games, you guys can figure out why this move was played. But it looks a little bit odd because it does pretty severely weaken this b4 square. And often we see a4 in these kinds of positions, but only after a6 and when black is threatened to play b5. But there's no such threat here. The idea is, of course, he wants to play rook a3, and then he's going to bring the rook across. Which is a fine point indeed, but you may ask, why not just rook c1 and then maybe later playing c3 to come across? Which, for one, coming to c3 is not possible because of this knight, but we can easily envision that a capture and that c3 becomes possible. But the real point is that black is going to be able to play rook c8 at some point. And when he does, that's probably going to lead to an exchange of those rooks. But from a3, that's not going to be possible. He's going to be able to play a3, rook a3, and bring the rook across to the kingside. And notice black can't play a5 and rook a6 and come across to contest it. Which what this means is that white is going to end up with an overwhelming superiority and forces on the kingside when, because of black's sort of restriction here with this e6 pawn, he doesn't have the same space that the d4 pawn affords. He's not going to be able to repeat that same maneuver. So we get bishop to c6, rook a3, and then h6, which h6 is designed to try to deal with this knight f5 threat. Which I get that looking at it right now, that doesn't make much sense. But his idea is that after knight h5 and the rook comes across, he wants to play g5 to try to shut down this g file. Instead, he might have considered playing g6. Now, I can fully understand why you wouldn't really want to do that, because these dark squares are just going to become awful. You don't have a dark squared bishop to help you defend them, and white of course does still have his dark squared bishop, so I can definitely see not wanting to do that, but possibly that might have been the lesser evil here. So h6, and then we get the bishop dropping back to b1. It still amazes me how often the b1 square is the best home for the bishop in these isolated queen pawn positions. Often we'll see it maneuver from c4 to a2 to b1. There's lots of ways it gets there, but it just seems like it gets there a lot. Of course, the idea is we're clearing the way for the rook. And then we get knight b4, which I think this shows another subtle point to white's play with a4. He weakened b4, and so black thinks to himself, well, b4 is a weakness, I should use that. And so he plays knight b4, but this is actually a mistake, because the kingside already is lacking in defenders. And by playing knight to b4, he's really just taken another defender away from the kingside. And on b4, you're not really doing a lot. Yeah, you're stopping me from playing bishop queen d3 or queen c2 to form that battery, but I don't intend to use those squares anyway. I'm going to come out to h5. The bishop is, of course, already on that diagonal, so maybe the knight b4 might make more sense if it was going to prevent the bishop from coming to this diagonal. So, for example, maybe if the bishop were on e2 or something like that, and he was going to deny it access, that might make some more sense. But here, it really just displaces the knight and further justifies white's decision to go for this kingside attack. So immediately, we're capturing this defender, which is going to leave him with no defenders. And notice, since he played knight b4, he's not going to be able to replace that knight. And so the queen has to capture. And then we get knight h5, which is just going to kick the queen right back out. I mean, clearly the queen probably doesn't want to stay on the king side anywhere, because when this rook comes across, it would probably just get to come across with tempo. So it makes sense why you had to go back to e7. And then the rook comes across to g3, immediately threatening this pawn here. But then after g5, we're starting to see something a little bit reminiscent of the Karpov game. And of course, just like Karpov, h4, cracking open the king side. Then f6, again, trying to maintain this pawn on g5 at all costs. But then we're just going to capture here, and then just like with Karpov, F4. Gonna just blasting lines open here. So we get Rook AD8, and then the pawn takes here, forcing recapture, and then we bring up the last of our forces to really bear down on the kingside. A second rook lift, this time using the 5th rank instead of our customary 3rd, but he's just getting all kinds of pressure against this g-pawn. And note the bishop here, the knight here, this rook, and this rook, which have all sort of been shoved to the shoved to the queen side, are all completely helpless in terms of trying to help defend this. Black tries to bring this rook up to try to indirectly counter the square, but then white just brings the queen up. He's going to add another attacker. So we get rook takes, and then the pawn takes, and then rook d8. But after this nice little in-between move, rook takes g5. Of course, we can't capture here. That's just not going to work at all. So he plays king g8. But after queen f4, black just resigns. It's impossible to deal with the threat of playing queen h4 followed by knight f6. Notice he can't even block with the queen here to try to anticipate the queen coming across, because this bishop all the way back from its little home on b1 is controlling that square. Again, a little bit picturesque, noticing that every single one of white's pieces all bear down on this completely exposed king, whereas we're left kind of wondering what this rook, bishop, and knight are doing off on this side of the board. So again, a really instructive and really interesting game, and this time no technique really required. He is only up a pawn, just like in the Karpov game, but he's not going to need another 20 or 30 moves to convert it. We're looking at maybe 3-4 moves at the most. So let's go back and take a look at the position featuring the rook lift, and kind of what about the position led white to choose to go for this kingside attack. And I think already here, the absence of the dark squared bishop plus this knight on g3 already suggests that we should be lining up for some sort of a kingside attack instead of playing for a d5 break or the attack on f7 or going for this f4 f5 plan. Excuse me. So we get after castles, bishop f4. Again, a new deployment, something to stick into our little box of ideas. And then excuse me, taking advantage of this e5 square, just bringing our pieces up, and then a4, this really interesting idea of avoiding the rook exchange here, which is going to give us more forces on the king side than black is going to be able to bring back himself. So we get bishop c6, and then after h6, and then now this really key mistake of knight b4, really just allowing black to really amp up the pressure here. Notice all these pieces are coming to the king side with tempo, which is not giving him any time to bring his defenders back across. After h4, as he hasn't got to play any moves that he really wants to, just because black is left with constant threats after every move. Perhaps this is the first chance he really had to try to bring a piece into the game, but there's just really no effective way to bring a piece back that's really going to be meaningful. So again, just a really nice, straightforward, direct attack against the king side, which yielded a absolutely crushing position and almost a miniature. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this in this game, and like I said, this finishes up the games featuring the rook lift, and next we're going to be moving on to games featuring a sacrifice on h6. So I hope you guys look forward to those, and I'll get those out to you in a couple days. Thanks a lot, guys. I hope you enjoyed this and found it instructive, and are going to be able to start using these ideas in your own games. Anyway, signing off now. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.